Hi everyone, welcome back to the Property Finance Podcast, and today I want to do something a little bit different. So I'm actually not going to be talking about finance. So recently I've had quite a few questions where clients have phoned me, where people who I've mentored have phoned me, and they've said, Michael, how do you find your deals? How do you analyse your deals? How do you look over the deals that you're looking at? And I thought, you know what, that makes a bloody good podcast. So I thought, I've written a load of notes, so I thought I'll keep it kind of in sections, and I thought, you know what, I'll run through actually what I do as a checklist when I'm looking at deals. So in terms of when we're first looking for a deal, so I'll take it right back to basics, and we'll literally run from start to finish of the entire process. So in terms of location, that's kind of the first thing that anyone wants to look at. And it's analysing the location, understanding the location, and basically getting comfy with the location that you're looking at, and making sure that you're kind of happy to build a business there and a development company there. So there's a few key points that I look for when I'm doing my location analysis. So first thing is obviously economic growth. So I want to know that the area that I'm investing in has got good potential for economic growth, whether it be, for example, rising employment, whether it be investment in infrastructure, whether it be regeneration projects, whatever it may be. I'm looking for those kind of things. I want to be investing in an area with the potential for growth. The second thing that I want to look for when I'm doing this location analysis is transport links. So whether it be major road networks, whether it be train stations, public transport, whatever it may be, I'm looking for these things, because when you're identifying kind of where you're going to sell these properties to, you need to understand, right, okay, so for one of the developments we're looking at the minute, it's based in Lincolnshire, and for us, it's kind of, it's on the outskirts of a town. But for us, it's, okay, where are our closest sort of networks? So, okay, there's Peterborough train station is half an hour away from where we're looking at building these houses. Right, okay, half an hour to drive to Peterborough train station, 49 minutes then, or 47 minutes from Peterborough into London King's Cross. Okay, so looking at that, you're talking an hour and 15 minutes to get from these houses to London. Right, okay, so when we look at that, we know actually there's a potential for commuters to want to look at this. Is an hour and 15 minutes, an hour and a half, unreasonable for a transport into London? Probably not. Is it going to be far cheaper to buy in Lincolnshire than buying in London? Yeah, definitely. So there's some of the things we look at, obviously, when we're looking at transport links and that kind of thing. Then the other thing that I want to look at is demographic. So I want to understand who's living in these areas. Is it a retirement village? Is it where people go to retire, to enjoy those later years in their lives? Is it mainly a bungalow sort of centric town? Is it young professionals are going to live there? So is it mainly apartments, first-time buyers, small houses, 2-3 bed houses? Or is it going to be large detached houses because it's large families who are maybe moving from London? They've had their third child. London's just too busy. They're moving from London now to somewhere a bit further north where they can afford bigger houses, bigger gardens. So they're the kind of things that I want to look for in terms of demographics and demand. Then the other bit I'm looking at is local amenities. So things like good schools, hospitals, retail. It sounds silly, but is there a big shopping centre nearby? Is there somewhere where people can go and shop? Is there access to these sort of retail centres that you have? And again, that was something that we looked at here, was that there was access to places like Queensgate, which is a massive shopping centre in Peterborough. Didn't have a great reputation until recently, but they've just gone through a massive regeneration project. They've put millions and millions and millions into this place. There's a new cinema, there's a new bowling alley, all sorts of other stuff. So this Queensgate has now become this massive hub for basically going out with the family for the day. The next bit that I'm looking at is crime rates. So in terms of the area, is there a high crime rate? Is it going to be off-putting to families? Is it going to be off-putting to young professionals? Is it going to be off-putting to anyone who's sort of looking to move into the area? So that's something else I look at as well. That probably is further down the list. I'm not as bothered about that, because the problem with crime rates is you can look at one website or one set of information and the crime rate is through the roof and you're expecting to be burgled every other day. You can look at another website, there's no crime in the area whatsoever. So I think it's really difficult with the crime rate stuff to kind of get a real feel for kind of where it actually sits. Then the next bit I'm looking at is supply and demand. So I'm looking at places like Rightmove, Zoopla. Is there loads of stuff sticking on the market? Are rental properties stuck there for months on end? Are properties going up for sale and sticking there for a year, 2 years? I want to understand the area. I want to understand, obviously I don't have a crystal ball, but I want to understand what's going on there historically and try and get a bit of an indicator of, obviously developments are 18 months, 24 months sometimes, but sometimes I can use that to get a bit of an indicator of, right, this is what's going to happen moving forward. So a few of the tools that I kind of use when I'm doing this is obviously Rightmove, Zoopla, On the Market, all the usual kind of house sale websites. The other thing as well for demographic data is obviously looking at the Office for National Statistics as well, so ONS data, and using that to understand kind of who's living where essentially. And then in terms of regeneration projects, obviously you can have a look mainly in the local news, you're going to find them there, but council planning portals will also have some indication of what's going on in the area as well. And then local transport kind of updates, if you like. So HS2, obviously there's constant updates around that and kind of what's happening with that. If you're in London, obviously you look at TfL, so Transport for London, that kind of thing. But looking at sort of local transport data providers, etc., and understanding, are they expanding, are they regenerating, are they doing X, Y, and Z? Is the local train station being upgraded and regenerated? And just understanding that stuff. So just a quick summary, when I'm doing location analysis, so it's economic growth, transport links, demographics and demand, local amenities, crime rates, and supply and demand. They're the main things that I'm looking for when I'm looking at the location. So then moving into a bit more sort of analysis around kind of the comparable market analysis. So we'll call this CMA. So basically I'm analysing the local market conditions. I'm understanding, again, in a bit more detail, what's selling, and what's sticky on the market. I'm also getting into a bit more data around, is everything being listed for an asking price and then selling for 10, 20% less? I need to understand that, obviously, when I'm looking at this data. Obviously, the other thing as well is checking rental yields. So depending on what I'm developing, if I'm doing an HMO, if I'm doing a buy-to-let, if I'm doing SA, etc., I want to understand the rental yields. I want to understand the demand in the area for an HMO. I want to understand the demand in the area for buy-to-lets. I want to understand the demand in an area for student accommodation, service accommodation, all those kind of things. I want to understand what the demand is. So I really want to dig into that as deep as I can. And then the other bit that I want to look at, and this is kind of something that people forget about, and I suppose just being in the industry that I'm in, it kind of always springs to my mind, but I want to understand who's developing in the area. Because if I've got a development of 10 houses, for example, let's say I'm going into a relatively small town, I want to build 10, 15 houses, but actually there's a development pipeline in that area where there's a developer building 120 houses and we're both going to be finished at the same time. My worry is, okay, well, that's 135 units going to the market at the same time. Is there realistically a demand in the area for 135 units? So that's a massive thing for me, is actually, am I going to be exposing myself to risk here whereby someone else is developing something larger, maybe even nicer in the area, and actually that's just going to wipe my stock out and potentially affect the market value of my stock? And the other thing as well to bear in mind is that if there's a developer doing, and I'm talking from experience here actually, because where the 13 units were being built, there's 118 being built literally just down the road, albeit they're different kind of stock, but there's a lot of houses going to the market at the same time. The risk you run is that potentially if you're up against a big national house builder, they have the ability to drop their prices. They aren't as worried necessarily about these large margins. So they can work off a slightly smaller margin potentially because they have scale. So the worry that I would have is, okay, are those 118, 120 units, are they actually going to bring the market value of my properties down? Because we're building similar stock. I'm listing mine for example, 300 grand, but they're listing theirs for 275. Am I actually then going to have to list mine at 275 to compete with them? The problem you've also got is reputation as well, because if there's a developer building 118 units nearby and they're a big national house builder, is someone going to come to the market looking for a house to purchase? Are they going to go with the big national house builder because they go, right, that's a brand we can trust. That's someone who we know builds houses. We know that they're going to look after us. We know that they're going to be able to come and deal with any snagging issues or anything that we've got. Are we going to go with them? Or do they go for the bespoke house builder? Do they go for the house builder that's built 13 units? Does it feel like a more personal touch? And that's where you've got to understand the area a little bit. And I think that's where that really comes into this as well. So just to kind of summarize that comparable market analysis, so I'm looking at sold prices versus asking prices. I'm looking at rental yields and demand, and I'm looking at development pipeline as well. So that's development pipeline for the town, for the local area. Then the next thing that I'm looking at is planning. So I want to understand planning potential. I want to understand planning constraints. I want to understand, what am I going to be able to do with this plot of land that I found? Because you're not always going to find a plot that has planning already. So sometimes you've got to think outside the box. You've got to think, well, actually, do I bring it a step back? Do I look for land instead without planning? do I take the planning risk and then try and achieve what I want on that plot of land, as opposed to sort of shoehorning myself to someone else's vision? So when I'm looking through this, so the deal comes in, I want to look at the existing planning permission. I want to understand what's the existing planning permission in place. Is there any onerous conditions, any pre-commencement conditions that I sort of need to deal with and need to understand? Is there anything in there that's going to cause me a big problem? We've got one at the minute for a client who's doing a barn conversion. They've got to apply for a license, which essentially they can't start development for the first 3 months. So they purchase the property, they then have to apply for a license. This is to do with bats and owls nesting. So they have to apply for a license essentially to start the development. It takes about 3 months to get that. They're going to lose the first 3 months of that development. So it's things like that I want to check and want to understand and want to be aware of. Also, the other reason for kind of checking the existing planning permission is, if there's an existing planning permission in place, is there then the ability to tweak it, amend it slightly, go for slightly larger units? That's the thing I want to kind of understand. Then the other thing is, if I'm sent an office, for example, which I get to see fairly often at the moment, is, am I going to be able to do it under permitted development? Is there anything stopping permitted development? Is there anything that's going to essentially mean that I have to go for full planning instead? If I go for permitted development, is it going to work? Am I going to be able to get what I want there? So yeah, I just want to understand the permitted development rights when it comes to that property. The other thing is, if I'm looking at an HMO, for example, so we see a lot of this for clients more so than myself. I'm not massively into HMOs, but we see this more for clients. But are there any Article 4 restrictions? Obviously, they need to understand that, because if they've got to go for full planning to create any kind of HMO, obviously that adds huge time constraints, and potentially they may not even get planning as well. I'm also then looking at local plans, housing targets. I'm trying to understand what are the council needing to achieve in this area. That then basically allows me to, this sort of 2 points, that it allows me to understand, if I get a plot of land, how far I can push it. But it also allows me, if I get a plot of land that's already got planning, can I go in and maybe get a couple of extra units on there? So understanding that as well kind of gives me a bit of an indication as to what I can sort of get away with. And then obviously understanding green belt and conservation areas as well. Obviously that's going to impose design and environmental constraints as well. The key checks that I want to be doing, I want to obviously go on planning portal, local council websites, want to speak to planning consultants. They're kind of the main people that I'm engaging with on here. So again, quick summary of the kind of planning stuff is checking the existing planning permission, understanding permitted development rights, looking at Article 4, whether that applies in that area or not, looking at the local housing plans and housing targets, and then obviously understanding whether it's green belt or conservation area as well. Very, very important, the conservation area side of things, because dealing with conservation officers is a nightmare. So I've done all of that. I've gone through all of that initial due diligence, and I then get to the point of, right, okay, I understand what I've got. I understand what the project's going to look like. I understand what I can achieve. Now I need to go through the financial feasibility. And this is, as you'll find out from the length of this podcast, this is a pretty in-depth dive into kind of what you need to do on every deal. But this takes some time to go through every deal properly. So when I'm doing my financial feasibility, I'm looking at the GDV. That's the first thing that I'm looking at. So my gross development value. I want to understand, what are these properties going to achieve when they sell at the end? And I need to almost do 3 versions. And we picked this up from a couple of clients that we've mentored previously, is we actually found the most effective way when going through their deals was set a low figure, set a medium figure, kind of that realistic achievable figure, and then set a high target. So if you were to do a slightly nicer finish, if you were to do something just a little bit bespoke, maybe building out of stone as opposed to brick, could you achieve that higher GDV? What's the cost then versus that higher GDV? So in terms of sort of looking at those GDVs, there's a few things that I want to have a look at. So I want to understand comparable sales data for the last 6 to 12 months. I want to be speaking to at least 3 estate agents, I would say, as a rule of thumb. So I want to speak to 3 estate agents, because every estate agent has a different opinion. And it's really important to come back to that, is all of this is opinion based. Nobody can tell you what that property is definitively going to sell for in 18 months' time. It is all opinion based. So I need to look at 3 different estate agents' opinions, and I need to take as long as they're all relatively close to each other, I need to take kind of the median of all of those and go, right, this one's come back here, this one's come back here, this one's come back here. They're all kind of within 10% of each other. Great. Okay, I'm going to take kind of the average of all 3 of those and apply that as my achievable. And potentially you might have one that comes back with a higher figure, one that comes back with a lower figure. And actually you've kind of got your lower and higher GDVs almost kind of done for you. The important thing as well when you're looking at GDVs is obviously you need to understand kind of the specification, what size they're going to be. You maybe need to have a look at kind of local trends of what's going on in terms of what else is everyone building. Are there any other developers who have maybe just started a development or are going through a development or just listing a development who you can kind of have a look at what they've done and understand what they're pricing theirs at. And then the other thing that you need to do when looking at the GDV, and this is where the lower and higher end of the GDVs comes in, is obviously you need to, bearing in mind what's kind of happened to the economy over the last 3 or 4 years, you need to anticipate for another list truss, basically, is kind of what you need to do. So you need to anticipate that there's going to be a market downturn, so potentially prices might drop. And you also need to think actually a little bit optimistically and think, well, what happens if the prices go up a little bit? And that's where this lower and higher GDV comes in. Once I've done that, once I've had a look at the GDV, once I understand what my GDV is going to be, I can then use that figure to work out my residual land value. So in layman's terms, that residual land value is essentially going to be what I can afford to pay for that land. One of the big things that we've found when we've analysed deals for mentees and clients is actually kind of ignore the asking price. That's kind of my first rule of thumb is it doesn't matter what the vendor wants for it, ignore it. You need to do all of this due diligence and this kind of working through numbers in order to work out what you can afford to pay for the property. You can only proceed based on what you can afford. And I think that's where doing this residual land value is really, really important. So just as kind of the metric, if you like, is you work out your GDV, you take off your developer's profit, which is normally about 20%. So you take 20% off your GDV, you then minus your build costs, your professional fees, contingency, finance, etc., all of your cost essentially. And that then leaves a figure that is affordable for you to pay for that property. It could be that is higher than what the asking price is, in which case, great, okay, we can afford the asking price. 99.9% of the time, it's going to be lower. There's just, that is how the market works at the minute. The figure that you get to as affordable is going to be lower. The other thing to bear in mind as well is that when you build in the financing costs, that is going to drop your residual land value. So that is going to drop what you can afford for the property because obviously there's a financing cost in there that you're bringing out. So you're trying to achieve 20% profit net after finance, contingencies, everything else. That's kind of the dream figure. Now, if that's miles away from what the vendor is looking for the property, you could potentially drop that profit down to 15% because 20% net is great. That is phenomenal. That is the absolute unicorn of a deal. Achieving 15% net is still pretty good. And most lenders would still be happy with 15% net on a deal as well. So there is a bit of leniency there in terms you want to go for, but I would say work it at 20% profit to begin with. If the figure is lower than what the vendor is after, then obviously you're just going to have to put it in and see what happens. So yeah, in terms of residual land value, just to kind of summarize that again, so it's GDV, less your build costs, less your professional fees, less your finance, less your contingencies, less your profit. And that contingency could be anywhere from 7.5% to 10% on your build costs. So in order to work out the residual land value, I've obviously got to understand what my build costs and contingencies are. So this is where if you have a builder, great, you can just pick up the phone to them, speak to them, understand from them, what are you charging £1 a square foot? What is it going to cost me approximately to build out this development? Now, your pound per square foot is going to vary massively from deal to deal. So I've got clients who are building out for £110 a square foot if it's a self-build. I've got clients who are building out for £160 a square foot. I've got clients who are building out for £250 a square foot. It really does depend what you're doing, whether it's conversion, whether it's a new build, etc. Anyone who tries to tell you this is what you can build for as a pound per square foot, who isn't a builder, don't listen to it. Speak to a builder, understand from them, what is that cost going to be? And they might not be able to give you a cost as a pound per square foot, but have that conversation with them, understand they might have an average for the area or something that they can give you just so you can work out on this kind of initial due diligence what you want to do. Obviously, they're going to be taking into account material, rising labour costs, etc. The bit that they can't take into consideration, this is where the contingency comes in, is they can't anticipate for unexpected cost. So they can't deal with anything. If they find asbestos, if it's conversion, for example, if they find asbestos, or if you're digging into the ground and find a Viking coin or a Viking longship, both of which have happened on sites that we've seen before, they can't deal with site clear or understand site clearance until they've done the site clearance. They're not going to know what's underneath. On one of our sites, for example, there's a huge, great big, I don't even know what you describe it as, bramble until they've pulled all that away, they're not going to understand what the ground condition is like underneath. So they can't really anticipate for any of that. So that's what the 10 to 15% contingency is for. I'd say you can go as low as 7.5% on refurbs and conversions, because there's an existing structure there. You kind of know what you're dealing with to a certain degree. Digging into the ground, unless you have an X-ray machine that can look into the ground, you've got no idea what you're going to be dealing with. So conversions, refurbs, 7.5%. New build, 10 to 15 is where I'd aim. So once I've understood my build costs and my contingencies, I then need to understand my finance costs. Obviously, I'm in a very lucky position. I know my financing costs inside out. Obviously, not everyone is going to know, but that's where we try and come in and assist with, obviously, this deal analysis. Is we will look over the deal for you and go, right, okay, based on these initial numbers, because by this point in your due diligence, you're going to understand what the GDV is, you're going to understand what the build cost is, what your contingencies are. You're also going to have a fairly good idea of what the asking price is. So at that point, I can then look and go, right, okay, well, the financing costs based on if you bought it for this amount and the build was this, contingencies are this, etc., the finance is going to look like this. And that could be in a couple of different ways. I might look at bridging finance, development finance, mezzanine finance, might look at joint venturing finance, might look at equity finance. There's all these different financing structures that I can look at. But we're essentially going to look to model it out based on whatever the best financing structure is. So at that point, that's where we would step in and kind of help with the financing costs. And who knows, if you've come onto the mentorship or whatever, or if we're sort of dealing with you as a client, some of this analysis that's happened before we can kind of help with as well. But this financing bit is where we would kind of expect to step in and start to build out some of this costing. So you then have an understanding of the finance cost. So at this point, we've got what the asking price is, we know what the build cost is, we've got an idea of what the GDV is, we've got an idea of the financing cost. So the last bit that I need to understand in order to get to my kind of residual land value, what I'm going to offer, is I need to understand the professional fees. So there's a couple of professionals that you always want to account for. So it's your architect, your planning consultant, your solicitor, your surveyor, your engineers, so that's your structural engineers. They're all going to be pretty much at the top of that list of professionals that you want to bring in. You might also have project managers as well, for example, depending on how you've sort of structured yourself. You might have some other fees in there that we haven't covered, but they're kind of the 4 or 5 that absolutely, without a shadow of a doubt, are going to be there on every single deal. So I would get yourself an architect, speak to an architect. That architect might also take on the role of architect and planning consultant, so they might cover both bases. Get yourself a good solicitor. I've done numerous podcasts on solicitors and kind of how to get the best possible solicitor in place. You want a solicitor that understands development. Don't just go to your family conveyancer that you've gone to for the last 10, 20 years. Deal with a solicitor that understands development finance, understands developments. And then obviously your surveyors and structural engineers, that they're normally going to be ones that you either pick up through word of mouth or you may know some already. The other fee that I would kind of build into this, which I think is worth it, well, there's 2 actually that I'd build into this, and that's your stamp duty and your VAT. So the other fees that you need to build in are what's it going to cost me for stamp duty. So obviously speak to your solicitor, your accountant, etc. Understand what your stamp duty is going to be. Have a chat with maybe a stamp duty specialist as well. Just a quick Google will find you many of those. But there are plenty of guys out there, and I'm happy to obviously recommend some who will help you maybe reduce your stamp duty if it's possible. VAT is a big one. That comes up on more and more deals now, especially commercial conversions. So you need to check whether, if someone's listed it for 500 grand, does that include VAT or is there VAT on top of that? Because actually all of a sudden you're going from having to find 500 grand to having to find 600 grand. It's a massive jump up. And obviously while you can claim VAT back, obviously you've got to think about how you're going to cash flow that as well. So again, speak to a VAT specialist if there is VAT involved as well. And we do, as a commercial brokerage, we do have access to VAT bridging as well, which not many people know about. I can probably do another podcast on that at some point. And we also do have access now as well to stamp duty bridging as well, which again, probably another podcast on that as well. But there's a couple of different things there. So by that point, you know your professional fees, you know your stamp duty, you know your VAT, if there is any. That builds up that sort of professional fees pot. So in summary, to get to that residual land value, so to get to this is what I'm going to pay for the property, I'm dealing with, okay, what's my GDV? What's my build cost? What are my professional fees? What's my financing costs? Stamp duty, VAT costs, etc. I'm working all of that out, including profit as well, taking that off of the overall GDV figure, and that is what I'm then going to offer for that property. Whether it goes through or not, who knows? But you can only really offer what you can afford to pay. And I think that's where a lot of newer developers get dragged into this bubble of, I can offer anything because it doesn't matter if I make the profit because it'll be a first development and I'll be getting onto the ladder and everything else. And you've got to be so careful. I think there's a huge risk, I think, around getting into that excitement phase. So just make sure you do all the due diligence properly. Make sure you go through all these numbers into infinite detail and at that point, offer what you can afford to pay. Talking of risk. So this is where, once I've done all of that, I then go into trying to talk myself out the deal. And it sounds stupid, but you've got to go through this process. So I then go through my risk assessment phase. So there's a few things that I want to look at, and I'll break these down into little sections. So the first thing that I want to look at is market risk. So we've kind of spoken about this before, but realistically, if prices drop, is this property or this project actually still going to work? I need to understand if there's a 10% drop in the market over the next 18 months, am I still going to make profit? Am I still going to be able to get out of this project? So I need to look at that. I need to understand, right, okay, what do I do in the worst case scenario? Am I still going to get out of this? The next one, and this has come up so many times over the past couple of years, obviously it's not as much of an issue at the point of recording, but it has been an issue, and that's what happens if the interest rate increases again. If I've got higher borrowing costs, am I still going to get the margin that I want? If I have higher borrowing costs, am I going to be able to refinance the projects at the back end? If I'm developing a buy-to-let project, so if I'm doing, for example, a development of 6 houses and I then want to rent all of them at the end, well, if interest costs shoot up over the next 18 months, are they still going to work as buy-to-lets? Or am I going to have to rely on them selling? So I have to go through that process and understand that. And then the last one I do kind of under market risks is I need to understand what is going to happen if there's a rental demand shift. So if I'm developing an HMO, for example, or student accommodation, what happens if all of a sudden there's a shift in demand? What if all of a sudden the local university decides that they're going to offer their own accommodation? What happens if all of a sudden the local university turns around and says, no, you're not allowed to use any external accommodation, you have to use our accommodation? What happens if I'm doing an HMO and all of a sudden 20 other HMOs open up and all of a sudden everyone's shifted into those HMOs and there's no one left to move into mine? What happens if, for example, I'm building an HMO in an area where there's a large hospital, and let's say, for example, I want to aim for doctors and nurses? What happens if all of a sudden, and this is really going into some serious risk, but what happens if that hospital closes down? Never going to happen, but what happens if that happens? Am I able to shift my demographic? Am I able to shift kind of who I'm going for? So under market risks, I'm looking at what happens if the market drops? What happens if the interest rate goes up? What happens if rental demand goes down? They're the three things. And I need to understand each of those scenarios kind of in full. Then it gets onto planning risk. So this is understanding if I'm going for planning permission, I need to understand. And one of the big risks when it comes to this is you're either going to have to buy land without planning or you're going to have to do an option to get that land without planning and go through the option period and try and obtain planning throughout that. But no matter how you get to that point, you've got to put some cost in to get to planning. So you need to understand, right, okay, if I'm putting 10, 20 grand in for planning, what happens if it gets refused? The biggest thing with the refusal, well, there's two things. One, it's the loss of money, but two, it's the loss of time as well. Because if you're doing a sizable development, you could be 6 to 12 months in planning. If it then gets refused, what a massive waste of time. So with that, the way that I would mitigate that risk is getting a good planning consultant. That, without a shadow of a doubt, is absolutely a must. And then the other one is a pre-app. So doing a pre-application for planning is essentially putting in a pre-app that says, right, this is what we're looking to do. And then the council coming back and saying, okay, yeah, if you submit something along those lines, we think we might be able to get behind it. It's not a guarantee by any stretch of the imagination, but it would give you some sort of idea as to whether or not they're going to accept it. So it takes a little bit of the risk out, but by no means takes all of the risk out. So the other bit that I'm looking at is what if the council imposes a Section 106? What if they do a community infrastructure levy, for example? These can be big, massive additional costs, sometimes that could wipe a development out. So you've worked all of your numbers. So let's say you're going into an option agreement. You've worked all of your numbers. You've offered the vendor X amount. Then all of a sudden the council come back and you say, actually, there's a Section 106 and it's going to be 50 grand, or there's a SIL payment of 50 grand. All of a sudden, your numbers are massively out of whack. So that is a massive thing that you need to keep an eye on. Again, good planning consultant will help with that. if a Section 106 gets applied or a SIL gets applied. So you could do a feasibility statement, which then potentially, again, costs a lot of money. But essentially you're asking someone to do a feasibility statement to say, this Section 106 or SIL payment is going to make the project or development unfeasible, and asking the council to remove it. The last one that I'm looking at is flood zones, contamination, and TPOs. So that's tree protection order. So what I need to look at with that is, if there's a massive oak tree, for example, in the middle of the land, are they going to impose, if there isn't already a TPO in place, are they potentially going to impose one? We need to look at that. We need to understand that, because the problem with that is if you can't take that tree out, actually it could render the entire development useless, and you have to kind of build around it, and it could completely change the plan that you've got in place. So when it comes to planning risks, I'm looking for, essentially if there's been any Section 106 or SIL charges applied to anything sort of in the local area. I want to understand from a planning consultant, what are my risks here? Is it something that could potentially happen? And also potentially, am I then going to have to look at the additional cost of a feasibility statement? I need to understand from the planning consultant what are my chances of refusal. Again, pre-app can help with that as well. And then the environmental issues. So there's quite a lot under planning risk. And this is why some people decide to go for sites that have already got planning in place, because again, it kind of gets rid of all of that risk. You know what you're dealing with from the outset. However, even a site with full planning, like we mentioned earlier, it can still have those issues around onerous pre-commencement conditions and things like that. So they're all different things that you need to look at under planning. The next one I want to look at, and this is kind of in conjunction with the builder, and depending on how good your builder is, depends on whether they're going to be any good at this section or not. I want to understand the construction risks. I want to understand what happens if there's a delay. What happens if there's a material shortage? What happens if all of a sudden my contractor goes bust? How do I get out of all of these situations? So I need to understand from the outset, is my contractor liquid? Is he going to be able to deliver the project? Is there anything which potentially could cause him a problem, cause him to walk off or anything like that? And again, there needs to be a bit of trust and honesty on both sides there, but I need to understand that. Material shortages, I don't think is as much of a problem now, because we seem to have plateaued in terms of materials and price of materials. In terms of weather, we can't control the weather in the UK. There's no way that we can. We've had some of the wettest summers. We've had some of the hottest winters. Like, it's just ridiculous. You cannot understand or predict what the weather is going to do. So I have to have that as a risk in my mind of a delay potentially, but there's nothing I can really do with that. So I just have to have it in my head of, right, okay, if we are delayed 3 months because it rains every day for 3 months, what are we going to do? And I think for that, the way I would get around that risk is just maybe taking an extra 3 months on the development finance. The way I'd get around that is speaking to the development lender and just saying, look, it's going to take me 18 months to develop this. It's going to take me 6 months to sell it, so 24 months in total. I'm going to need 3 months extra just in case I run over. So you push it to 27 months potentially. And it's just taking that little bit of contingency of time as well. So that's the first kind of construction risk that I want to analyze, is what happens if there's any delays. The next thing is what happens if there's any cost overruns. Now, this is where it's really, really important to get a good QS or a good project manager in place. In fact, actually, you may even want to get both. But getting a good QS on board, they go through the tendering process with you if you bring them on board early on. And we've done lots of podcasts about this, just to have a kind of search back through. But you need to get them to do that tendering process. You need them to deal with the JCT contracts. That JCT contract has to deal with cost overruns. It has to. It has to cover what happens if that's a problem. The other thing that you need to do as well is understand, right, okay, what percentage loan to GDV am I at? Is there going to be any scope that if I get halfway through this development and there's a massive cost overrun, am I going to be able to go back to the development finance lender and borrow additional money? Am I going to be able to go and get mezzanine finance? Am I going to be able to speak to investors? So you need to understand what happens if there's a cost overrun. So that's a massive one. The last one that I want to do when it comes to construction risk is quality issue, is probably the best way of describing it. So what do I do if my builder does a shit job? And the problem is that you are never, ever, ever going to know that, because you don't know what they're going to build. What you can do to negate that risk to a certain degree is look at stuff that they've done previously. Don't take a builder on if they haven't done something of a similar scale previously, or something that you can at least look at. A quick Google search, Trustpilot, all those kinds of things, they all help to understand, is this contractor good? Do they know what they're doing? What's the spec of the stuff that they've been doing before? Have a look, because The problem you've got is if you get to the end of a development, so say you're building 118 houses, if you get to the end of that development, if you've got snagging on 118 houses at 10 grand a plot, that's over £1 million that you've got to spend just purely on snagging. Now, that's a pretty extreme example. However, even if you said £1,000 of snagging per property, you're talking £118,000 just to rectify issues that should never have been issues to begin with. So getting a good builder can really save you a lot of money. So that's one of the big risks that I always have in the back of my mind is I need to get someone who's good, who's done this before, who's done something of a similar scale, delivered it, and has delivered it well as well. So that's always a big thing. And then the last kind of risk that I want to be looking at is kind of on the legal and title side. Now, this I'm not as bothered about. This kind of falls fairly far down the scale. I mean, being an ex-conveyancer, I've kind of got, I can look at a land registry title and I can go, right, okay, there's a covenant there, there's a restriction there, there's a right of way there, right? I understand that. I've got a pretty good understanding of what that's going to be like and the issues it can cause. But for a layman who hasn't come across that before, there's kind of three things that you want to be looking at, and you deal with these with your solicitor. So the three things that I'm looking at is any ownership disputes. So we had a property recently where what happened is there was a plot of kind of a strip of unregistered land. Now, what happens is they'd occupied, the previous owners had occupied that for so many years that they could then ask for a possessory title. The issue with possessory title is that obviously some lenders can't get comfy with it. There needs to be indemnity insurances in place. If that possessory title is over your access, for example, that could cause a massive issue as well. So you need to understand any ownership disputes. Is there any possessory title? Have you got full legal title? You just need to be aware of all of that. So all of those things can be dealt with the solicitor. A quick look over the land registry titles, they'll be able to tell you. Then the second thing you want to look at within kind of the land registry title deeds is any restrictive covenants. So are there any restrictive covenants actually blocking development? Because some of the restrictive covenants actually stop you from developing the property. If they're old enough, potentially you could have an indemnity insurance policy put in place, because if they're from the 1600s, 1700s, whatever, obviously the people that put those in place aren't going to be around anymore. However, if it was put in place in the 90s or the early noughties, then it could still be a problem. So again, you need to understand restricted covenants. The next bit, and the last one that I kind of mentioned it earlier, was right of way. So you need to understand if you're going over someone else's land to access the site, have you got right of way? If you've got anyone who's got right of way over your land, for example, are you going to cause issues by developing the land? Is it then going to stop their right of access, right of way? You've then got to look at that with the solicitor as well. So they're kind of the legal bits that I want to cover off with my solicitor early on. So to kind of summarize this section of risk assessment, so the four main points that I'm looking at are the market risks, which obviously we kind of covered was if house prices go down, if interest rates come up, and if rental demand drops. I'm then looking at the planning risks. So what happens if it gets refused? What if there's a Section 106 or a SIL payment? And are there any environmental issues? Then I'm looking at my construction risks, which is what happens if there's a delay? What happens if there's a cost overrun? What happens if there's a quality issue? And then the last one is my legal and title risks, which is ownership disputes, restricted covenants, and right of way. They're kind of all the things that I'm looking at under my kind of risk assessment side of things. So I've done the doom and gloom. So I've been through the good stuff. I've worked out all my numbers. I know that the deal works. I've gone through the bit where I've tried to talk myself out the deal. So I'm now at the point where I'm like, right, okay, I've got everything in front of me. This is starting to look like a deal. I then go into my deal structuring. And this is the bit that I'm most passionate about. And this is the bit where I get most excited about a deal, because this is where I know I can do my best work. This is where I'm going to make my profit. So many people will say you make most of your profit in the purchase. And it's true, because if you deal with this effectively and you put the right deal structure in place, you could make most of your money by sort of bringing that purchase price down. So the things that I'm considering kind of when I go into a deal is looking at my negotiation strategy. What can I look at here? Am I going to be able to lock in a lower purchase price? Is there, by using sort of feasibility studies, by using market research, all of the data that I've got, can I offer a lower price here? So can I go in and say, you know what, you've asked for this, that's fine, but based on all of the data that I've got, I can give you this. If I can lock in that lower purchase price early on, with all of that data to support it, at least I've put forward an offer. So we'll see if that comes in. The next one is deferred payments. So anyone who's listened to me do a talk, anyone who's listened to me do a podcast knows that I love a deferred payment. So this is paying part up front and then potentially paying the other part on the sale of the last property, or it could be paying it within a certain timescale. That's where I think you can really, really do some good stuff. One of the things, and funnily enough, I was doing a talk on this yesterday. I was speaking about deferred payments. I said, you know what, actually, a lot of people look at deferred payments and they say, actually, why would the vendor take this? Well, the beauty of a deferred payment is that actually, because of the way that it's structured, sometimes you can offer to give the vendor a bit more. So we mentioned a minute ago about sort of locking in a lower purchase price. The reason we've got to lock in that lower purchase price is because I've worked out my financing costs based on the kind of full amount. That's how I've gotten to that figure. If I'm only paying half up front and I'm paying the balance in 18 months, I'm going to have lower interest costs. I'm going to have potentially lower costs of entry. There's less risk, etc. I might be able to afford to pay a bit more. It's about creating that win-win. So for the vendor, yes, you've got to wait 12 to 18 months, but actually you're potentially going to get an extra chunk of money. So I think it's worth keeping that in mind, is that actually you might be able to offer that little bit more. Deferred payments aren't going to work on every single deal, but I think, and as I mentioned on this talk yesterday, I think you always want to put forward two offers to the vendor. And you say to the vendor, right, here's your offer for a straightforward purchase, X amount, whatever it may be. Here's your offer based on a deferred payment. This is what we could afford to pay if you let us defer part of that payment. So the last bit that I'm going to offer to the vendor is going to be a joint venture. So I'm going to say to the vendor, look, you want this for the land. That's fine. That's unachievable. I can't achieve that number. However, if you come into a joint venture with me, so if you put the land into an SPV, for example, we're going to go into the SPV together. They may not want to be in the SPV, so you might structure it slightly differently. But you say to them, come into this as a joint venture. We're then going to go and do the development. And because we're able to do the development, we don't need to borrow against the land or anything like that. We can give you that number that you want. Potentially, we can give you more than what you want. And that's where sometimes it can get quite appealing for them, because actually you say, look, you want this for the land, that's fine. Come into the joint venture. We will give you that at the end of the joint venture. You can have that guaranteed. But what we will do to make it even more appealing is we will give you that and we'll give you a share of the profit. So you want that for the land, you can have that and you can have a profit. So you're taking the risk by putting it into the SPV with us, but you're also sharing in the upside. And that can be really, really powerful when it comes to dealing with vendors. So I think that's again, when you're kind of putting forward the deferred payment option, it's also putting forward the joint venture option as well. And sometimes we found recently on a few deals is where it used to be a case of us having to negotiate with the vendor and kind of putting these ideas forward to the vendors. Estate agents have kind of become a bit wise to it now. So we're actually finding that estate agents are kind of saying, well, actually, have you thought about this? Have you thought about doing a joint venture? Have you thought about doing a deferred payment? And kind of putting those ideas forward to begin with. So that's kind of the stuff I'm looking at when I'm doing the deal structure and negotiation. Obviously, I've done loads of podcasts on kind of how I structure deals. But that's kind of where I get to that point. So I'm looking to lock in a lower purchase price. I'm looking at deferred payments. I'm looking at option agreements. I'm looking at JVs. They're all the things that I'm putting on the table. And vendors don't mind having options. Give them options and then they can choose. And it just gives them the power, puts the power in their hands. Because I think if you just offered a deferred payment, it gives them the ability to turn around and say no. And the problem is, as soon as they say no, you've lost your negotiation power. You're kind of stuck in this, oh, you said no to that, right, I've got to now put something else forward. Whereas if you put a number of options in front of them, it's more likely that they're going to choose one of those options. So I think it's really powerful to do that. Then the last bit that I'm looking at, and this kind of brings this all to a nice close, is I'm looking at my exit strategy. So I've done everything else. I've worked all my numbers out. I've worked out what I'm going to do in terms of my offer. My offer's gone in. I then start thinking about sort of a more intense exit strategy. So I've got all my usuals. I've got my sale. I've got my refinance. So I understand that I can either go and sell it on the open market. I understand that I can go and refinance at 75%. But I then want to push it that step further. And this is, again, as part of that risk assessment point, is coming up with numerous exit strategies. So I've got a couple of options here. I could either look at guaranteed sales. Yes, it's only going to be at 85% of market value, but is it worth having that guaranteed sale option there just in case there's a market shift, just in case there's a demand shift? I need someone lined up who potentially can buy it. Do I look at potentially some sort of co-living service accommodation strategy? So if I'm building a block of flats, for example? Do I keep a commercial unit downstairs, maybe on the off chance that I can then make it into some sort of co-living as opposed to just a block of flats? Do I potentially look at maybe bringing in a housing association or supported living provider? So if I'm, again, building a block of flats, do I look at bringing someone in who could take on the whole block of flats in one go? There's all these different things that you can start to line up. And I think it's really, really important to start lining these things up before you even commence the purchase, because the big thing, so take the supported living, for example. If I get a block of flats and I have a supporting living provider who comes in and says, right, we're going to lease it off you for 15 years. It's going to be a no break clause, 15-year lease. We're going to pay above market rent, everything else. It really does affect your end numbers because it actually pushes that GDV number up, which obviously then affects your borrowing figures as well. So I think it's worth getting these alternative uses kind of built up early on, because it really can have an effect on those end numbers, all for the positive, but it's worth lining those up. So lining up a sale, lining up a refinance, lining up some sort of alternative use, I think is really important. And it just, everything that we've mentioned previously regarding risk, it just starts to get rid of all of those risks and starts to build up a really nice picture. And don't get me wrong, if you got everything right, so everything we've been through in this episode so far, if you got all of that spot on, you have found an absolute unicorn of a deal. There's no two ways about it. Not everything that you go through in this analysis is going to be perfect. There are going to be bits in there that you're going to have to work on. There are bits in there that are going to make you question the deal. If you get all of it right, you've got a unicorn of a deal. You need to buy that deal no matter what, because if everything stacks up, you've got multiple exit strategies, you've got a good contractor who's absolutely no worry whatsoever, you've got maybe a deferred payment in place, you're onto an absolute winner of a deal. So essentially, in conclusion, that is what I do when I look at a deal. This has been a hell of an in-depth episode, but I think hopefully it's been really helpful for people who are either just starting or even the more experienced people as well. Hopefully this has just given you a bit of an idea of kind of that checklist of what you need to do when you're looking at a deal. And what I might do is, to accompany this episode, is kind of do a bit of a checklist actually that you can go and download. I'll try and put a link below. Have a look at that. That will give you the checklist, and you can literally tick it off as you go through. And it'll give you that step by step. Here we go. This is what I need to look through these deals. And as always, obviously, any of you can reach out to me and go through this with me. More than happy to go through this with anyone who needs kind of their hand holding throughout this for the first time. But I think the nice conclusion to come to, and I've made a little note here of the conclusion: strong location and demand, clear planning potential, a profitable financial model, so that 20% profit margin, multiple exit options, and mitigated risks. I think they are the 5 key points to finish off on. So thank you very much for listening. I'll catch you on the next one.